What we want to do tonight is introduce the subject of Samson and the story of Samson, or the narrative of Samson, as it's found in Judges. And we're going to spiral in on that story. I'm not sure if we'll get all the way to Judges chapter 13 tonight, but we'll see. Judges is the 7th book in the Bible. And in the plan that God has for the Scriptures, the 7 first books of the Bible follow out the themes of the 7 days of creation. Genesis is the book where God establishes light in the midst of darkness. When that happened the first time, there's no moral meaning to that. The world was just dark, and then God sent light into it. But after the fall of man, the moral darkness is in view, and the call of Abraham into the world is the call of light. And Abraham is told that he and his descendants will be like stars in the heavens, shining light. Now that theme comes all the way down to Jesus Christ, who is the Son, S-U-N, of righteousness, who rises with healing in its wings. But along the way, from the stars of Abram shining in the sky to Jesus, the sunrise, in the middle there, as we'll see, is Samson, because the word Samson means son. So he's in part of that. In Genesis, if we were to study it, we would see that it is itself laid out in 7 sections. But Genesis, in a very general way, follows the theme of the first day. And Exodus has to do with the separation of a heavenly people for God, and follows out the second day. Leviticus, the separation of land and sea, of Jew and Gentile, because that's the fundamental meaning of land and sea in biblical symbolism. Numbers, on the 4th day the sun, moon, and stars were created, and the book of Numbers pictures Israel as a cosmic host traveling through the sky from Egypt to the Promised Land. And the censuses of the Israelite people, those numbers, the numbers of people in the tribes, are all equivalent to astral figures. And so the host of Israel, as it's counted up, is equivalent to stars in the sky. I have a paper for sale downstairs on this. It's really complicated reading, but if you want the proof, it's there. God, in His providence, caused the tribes of Israel to multiply in such a way that their numbers came out to be the same as any number of significant numbers that show up in the patterns in the sky, in the movement of the planets in their courses. Deuteronomy, we have a swarm of people gathered together and given the law and told to be prosperous. That's the 5th day. And then the 6th day, Adam and Eve were made and put in the garden, and that's the book of Joshua, where we come into the Promised Land and we're settled. And at the end of the book of Joshua, we read that everybody has his own plot of land. Everything is great. They've all moved into the Promised Land, and the very last thing that happens in Joshua, this wonderful statement, Eleazar, the son of Aaron, died, and they buried him. The death of the high priest means that anybody who was stuck in a city of refuge got to go home. And so as the book ends, everybody has got to go home. Everybody's in his own plot of land. Everybody's in his own Garden of Eden. And then we come to the book of Judges, which is the 7th book. And you know, Adam and Eve, after God put them together and married them there on the 6th day, then God left and left them alone for a while. And when He came back on the next day, on the Lord's day, on the day of the Lord, on the Sabbath day, to have the Lord's Supper with them at those 2 trees, He found out that they had already sinned. And so instead of the Lord's day being a day of communion and celebration, the day of the Lord became a day of clouds and judgment and darkness and terror. And Adam and Eve were kicked out, and they were punished because of their sins. But God promised them salvation, and He set up cherubim with flaming swords to pass judgment on the wicked in order that the righteous might be delivered. All that happened on the 7th day. And those are the things that happen in the book of Judges. Judges expands that a whole lot. Now, ladies and gentlemen, when we look at narrative portions of the Bible, such as Genesis and Judges and the stories of David and other stories, we are really looking at pretty much the same story over and over and over again. It is the story of how God sets some people up and saves them and gives them a nice garden to live in. And then God goes away and leaves them alone for a little while. And as soon as God leaves, they blow it. And they mess up the garden and they ruin everything. And so when God comes back, He has to judge them. And blood has to be shed to restore them to what they've been given. The minute God turned His back on Adam and Eve, they went over and hung around and started looking at that tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and then the serpent came along and talked them into eating from it. And then God comes along, and He gives the whole world to Noah's sons, and the first thing that happens is one of Noah's sons attacks his father and comes under judgment. And then God calls the Hebrew children, the Israelites, out of Egypt, and He brings them all the way to Mount Sinai and gives them the law. And then He goes up to spend 40 days talking to Moses on the mountain. And as soon as God leaves, they go off and make themselves a golden calf. And they blow it. And God comes down and He judges them and He breaks the 10 Commandments. And then on the basis of blood, He gets back into covenant with them. Gives David a kingdom. And His Bible says as soon as David had peace with all of his nations round about, what'd he do? Went off and fooled around with Bathsheba. So his kingdom came under judgment, and the sword never left his kingdom till the day of his death. As soon as God brought the Jews back from Babylonia and set them up, what'd they do? First thing they do when they get back there, start intermarrying with pagan women, and Nehemiah and Ezra have to go beat them up for doing that. So, this is what we find in the Bible over and over again, and that's what happens here in the book of Judges. God has given the people this wonderful land, and then they sin. Now, you have the first page here, this chart called Structure of the Book of Judges, and I want you to look at it. This A, B, C, D, E, F, G, G, F, E, D, C, B, A way of writing things is called a chiasm. C-H-I-A-S-M. It's the way that's spelled. Chiasm. A chiasm is a literary form that is kind of a Chinese box structure that has something inside of something else. It's A-B-A, or A-B-C-B-A, or A-B-C-C-B-A. The Bible is filled with these. Filled with them. I suspect that probably every book in the Bible is chiastically structured. I'm not absolutely sure about that, obviously. But a whole lot of them are. The whole book of 1 Kings is structured that way. The Abraham narrative is structured that way. The flood narrative is structured that way. Genesis 1, the 7 days of creation, are chiastically structured. Over and over again, this is what we find. And there are reasons for it. It's a very complicated and very rich way of making associations. Look at this chart here. A says, up at the top, Israel's failure to hold the land against the Canaanites, progressive compromise and judgment, is the theme of the first section of Judges. Chapters 1, verse 1 to 2, verse 5. Now, matching that all the way down at the bottom, we find a story at the end in chapters 19 to 21 that Israel is faithful in destroying the tribe of Benjamin, which had become Canaanites. And this faithfulness leads to blessing and resurrection. Now, the book starts with the fall into sin, and it ends with a resurrection. There is motion from the beginning to the end of the book. But by looking at these two outside places, the A and the A, we see the brackets of the entire book and its theme. Then we look at the center of it. The very center core event in this book is the rejection of Yahweh as king. Jehovah, the Lord. I'm going to say Yahweh, okay? Grant me that. Yahweh is rejected as the king of Israel, and that is the turning point or hinge in the book, and that's the central event in the book. And it happens in the judgeship of Gideon. Gideon is faithful, and then Gideon falls into sin. Now let's look at the rest of this book and how it's structured. Look at B. B concerns Israel's, well, first of all, the A section is a whole record of how they conquered the land, and as they conquered it, they progressively got more and more compromised until finally the Canaanites were just living in their midst, and they really hadn't done all that much compromise. And then God came and said, because you haven't been faithful and dealt with the Canaanites, I'm going to leave them here as scourges for you, and you're going to be sorry. The second section, which is in chapters 2, verse 6 to 3:6, is a discussion of Israel's idolatry. And it gives the theme of the book of Judges and says that the people would turn to the idols, and when they turned to the idols, God would punish them, and then when they would repent, God would send them a deliverer. You've heard this before. Okay, everybody knows that's what Judges is about, or the grown-ups do anyway. But the main idea here, and this is something worth thinking about, the reason that they got conquered by Moab and Ammon is that they were fooling around with the gods of Moab and Ammon. And what God said was, well, if you like the gods of Moab and Ammon so much, well, I'll give you a little taste of the kind of society that's produced by those gods. And so I will let the society, the culture of the gods of Moab and Ammon take you over and see how much you like it. Well, of course, when the culture of the Moabites and the Ammonites took over, they didn't like it. So they would turn back to Yahweh. And then they'd go a-whoring after the gods of the Philistines. And then the Lord would say, oh, well, you like the Philistine gods so much? Well, you're just going to love being conquered by the Philistines and enjoying the fruits and the benefits of the gods of the Philistines. Of course, when that happened, they were unhappy about it. Whatever gods you worship, gods produce cultures. And if you turn to a certain god, God's eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, blow for blow, burn for burn, judgment, which is perfect judgment, is you go after the gods of the Russians, well, I'll let the Russians take you over. You go after the gods of the Philistines, I'll let the Philistines take you over, and we'll just see how much you like being under those gods. And if you don't like it, you might consider turning back to me. That's what happens. Now, this story of idolatry and turning to other gods in B is matched by an incredibly profound and rich story of idolatry in B prime in chapters 17 and 18, which would be fun to study, but of course we're going to study Samson, which is just as much fun, if we ever get to it. Those stories match each other. Israel's idolatry is the theme. Now, in C, the C story concerns northern Gentiles, Mesopotamia. A king named, what was his name? Cushan Rishathaim came from Aram Naharaim. That means the doubly wicked Cushite from Aram of the Double Rivers. He comes in and Othniel delivers them. Now the matching story to that in C is the southern Gentiles from Philistia come in and Samson delivers them. Samson and Othniel are both from the same part of the country, actually. Now, who are the Philistines? Would someone like to tell us who the Philistines are and where they came from? Any seminary students here? Well, the Philistines came from Crete. That's true. But in the Bible, where do they come from? Yeah, they came from Egypt. Genesis chapter 10 is very careful to tell us right at the outset so that we know that the Philistines are Egyptians. How many of you did not know that? Okay, now let me ask you to think about something. The Philistines conquer Israel, and then David fights a whole bunch of wars to deliver from the Philistines, and he lays up all the spoil, and all of that spoil goes to build the temple. What is that exactly like? It's exactly like the deliverance from Egypt, where they got all the spoils and built the tabernacle. And once you understand that the Philistines are Egyptians, then you'll see all kinds of parallels between the Exodus of Moses and the stories of Samson and Samuel and David. So the Philistines were not Canaanites. They were not one of the tribes that was supposed to be conquered. They were Egyptians. They moved into Israelite territory, so they had to be dealt with, but they were Egyptians. And in the book of Genesis, this is true too. Abraham goes down into Egypt, and Pharaoh attacks him and tries to steal his wife, and God plagues the Pharaoh, and Abraham comes up out of Egypt with spoil. Then he goes to Philistia, and Abimelech attacks Sarah, and God judges Abimelech, and Abimelech rewards Abraham, and Abraham gets even richer. Same story. Philistines are Egyptians. And then Isaac goes into Abimelech's territory, and Abimelech tries to mess with Rebekah, and God warns him, and Isaac gets rich. Same story. Coming out of Egypt with lots of goodies. Well, we have Gentiles here. Northern Gentiles in C, Southern Gentiles in C prime. Then the D section here, we're back on our page, concerns Lot. D, Ehud has to deal with the Moabites, and in D prime down at the bottom, Jephthah has to deal with the Ammonites. These are the two descendants of Lot. Then we have a minor judge, E, who is Shamgar, and we have minor judges matching that in the story just before Jephthah. Then we have Canaanites. The Canaanites are opposed in section F. It says the Canaanites got all together and they just decided to kick the Israelites back out of the land under Sisera. And this is a story where a woman is the victor. And Deborah, the mother in Israel, sends all of her sons out to fight. And as a matter of fact, it's one of the daughters, Jael, who crushes the head of the serpent, Sisera. And in the matching story down here under F prime, we have a story that some of you probably don't remember too well because it's not one that usually shows up in Sunday school literature. But we have King Abimelech, who is the son of a Canaanite woman and whose father was Gideon. And he's a Canaanite, and he reinstitutes a Canaanite civilization. And when he is fighting against the Israelites, a woman drops a stone on his head and crushes it. So in these two instances, it's the bride who does the fighting. Now remember what it says in Genesis chapter 3. What did God say to the serpent? I will put enmity between thee and the woman, and between thy seed and her seed. There are two conflicts. Satan fights the seed, who is Christ. Satan also fights the bride, who is us. And so in Judges, sometimes we see men fighting the serpent and crushing his head, and sometimes we see women fighting the serpent and crushing his head. And now we come to the center of the book, and this is the story of Gideon. Gideon starts out well, and you remember it's a very long story. God builds up Gideon's faith, and Gideon puts out the fleece, and he's not sure, but God reassures him. And then he gets all the men down at the water, and he tells them he's going to defeat him with just a few people, and Gideon's all nervous, so he gives them a dream in the middle of the night. He sees a big loaf of barley bread smush the camp of the enemy, and after the battle, Gideon comes back, and we have something very significant happen. In Judges chapter 8. Judges chapter 8, verse 22. We are right at the pivot of the book of Judges here. The turning point. Up till this time, Israel has sinned, but then they've recovered and they've done fine. This time they recover, but it's just not quite so good. Things are getting worse. Chapter 8 of Judges and verse 22. Then the men of Israel said to Gideon, rule over us, both you and your son and also your grandson, because you have delivered us from the hand of Midian. They offered him to be king, and they offered him a dynasty. Now, the Israelites knew two things. One, Yahweh was their king, and his ambassadors were the Levites, and the Levites were the pastors of the local churches, the local synagogues that were in every town in Israel. The other thing they knew from Deuteronomy 17 was that someday God was going to give them a human king, but it would come when God was ready. Now what they're doing here is jumping the gun, which is what Adam and Eve did in the garden. God said to Adam and Eve, I've given you every tree, it shall be food for you. He also said, don't eat from the tree of knowledge. That means since he told them that every tree would eventually be food for them, the tree of knowledge was only temporarily forbidden. Eventually they'd get to have it when they were ready. Well, God says to Israel, eventually I'm going to give you a king when you're ready. But now we see him jumping the gun. And this business of jumping the gun and demanding a king is just another outworking of the fall of Adam. Okay? It's kind of like wanting to have sex before you're married. It's kind of like jumping the gun on a lot of things. Running up your credit card to have a whole lot of nice things that you're not ready to pay for. Well, the tree of knowledge is out there, and it's a good tree. The Bible says it's a good tree. God says you can have it eventually, but only when he's ready. And he said they'd get to have a king, but when it was God's time. But now they're jumping the gun. They say, rule over us. We'll make you king. And in verse 23, Gideon said to them, I will not rule over you, nor shall my son rule over you. Yahweh shall rule over you. Because Yahweh is king. Gideon understands that. Then Gideon blows it. And he blows it by saying, in verse 24, I would request of you that each of you give me an earring from his spoil, because they had gold earrings, because they were Ishmaelites. So if you boys want to wear earrings, just remember it means you're an Ishmaelite. And they said, we will surely give them. So they spread out a garment, and every one of them threw an earring from his spoil. And the weight of the gold earrings that he requested was 1,700 of gold, besides the crescent ornaments and the pendants and the purple robes that were on the kings of Midian, besides the neck bands that were on their camels' necks. And Gideon made it into an ephod and placed it in his city Ophrah. And all Israel played the harlot with it there, so that it became a snare to Gideon and his household. Now, what is that story a parody of? I've already told you. Now let's see who knows. You defeat the enemy, and then you get the spoil, and you use the spoil to make the tabernacle or the temple. This time we defeat the enemy, and we get some spoil, and we build an ephod. Now, you all know what an ephod is, right? Wrong. And I don't either. But the high priest wore something called an ephod. And we don't know exactly what this word ephod means. But it means some type of an oracle, okay? And what happened was Gideon said, well, you know, the ark and the tabernacle and the high priest, you know, they're a couple of days' journey from here. And it'd be nice if we had a little answer box right here where we could talk to God and ask him questions, and he would tell us what to do. And so let's just set one up. And God had said not to do that. He said there was only to be one central sanctuary and no other sanctuaries. Now, every Sabbath day, they had church in Israel. It says in Leviticus 23, every Sabbath day you will have a holy assembly. It says in the law repeatedly, and it's shown in Judges and other places, that the Levites were in all the towns in Israel as pastors of these local synagogues. Synagogue is not something that was invented after the exile. The synagogue was there all along. And so what they already had, or were supposed to have, if they wanted information from God, was the Levites. And if the local Levite didn't know enough, he could go on over to a Levitical city, which was where there was a big theological seminary and also a university where all the Levites hung out and spent all their time studying books and studying the Bible, and they'd be able to help him out. So you didn't need to have another ephod here, but he sets one up anyway. And it says they played the harlot with it there. It became a counterfeit shrine. So Gideon, first of all, he says, the Lord will be your king. And then he does something that actually undermines the kingship of the Lord. And then, as the years went by, he got more and more compromised. Now we read this. In verse 29 of Judges 8. Then Jerubbaal, that's Gideon's other name. It basically means Baal fighter. Gideon, the son of Joash, went and lived in his own house. Now Gideon had 70 sons who came from his loins. And then we're told, because he had many wives. I think we could have figured that out. The Bible tells us that he had many wives to emphasize for us that he's committing the sin of polygamy. Polygamy is always a sin in the Bible. It's forbidden by Genesis 2, verse 24. For this cause a man shall leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife. If you're cleaving to your wife 24 hours a day, you can't get unstuck long enough to get another wife. You know, cleaving means this, you know. You can't get unstuck. Leviticus 18:18 and numerous other passages in the Old Testament forbid polygamy, but if you commit polygamy, you're stuck. It's kind of like chopping your arm off. It would be a sin to chop your arm off, but if you chop it off, you don't get to grow a new one. And if you're stupid enough to take a second wife, you're just going to have to live with it. You can repent of doing it, but now you've got responsibilities to both wives, and you can never be an elder in the church. Now Gideon had 70 sons, and I hope he had more than one wife, and we're told he did. By saying this, we see Gideon starting to act like he was somebody important. And then it says he had a concubine, which means a second-class or unendowed wife, who was in Shechem, who also bore him a son, and Gideon named him Abimelech. Abimelech means, my daddy is the king. Abi, my father, Melech, is king. Now Gideon names him, my daddy is the king, which means Gideon is the king. So having said that he didn't want to be king, as the years went by, he got more and more interested in kind of acting like a king and having 70 sons and all the rest. That's the turning point. From that point on in Judges, we see people trying to make themselves kings. The next story that's in the book is the story of Jephthah. And Jephthah is kicked out by his brothers who mistreat him. And so a bunch of other people who had been disinherited in the land come to him. The same thing happens to David later on. David is the second Jephthah. When David is out in the boonies, all those who the IRS has dispossessed and all those that the ATF has broken into their homes and taken all of their property away under confiscation laws, all those people go out and they hang around with Jephthah and David. And they're hanging around with Jephthah, and he gets an army together. And then the Ammonites come in on the land, and the people come to Jephthah and they say, you know, we're so sorry we mistreated you and all the other people. Would you and your army help us out? And so Jephthah says, I will if you'll make me king. And they say, okay, you can be the king. Now Jephthah would like to be the king, and he'd like to have a dynasty, but he only has one child. He doesn't have 70 children. He only has one, and it's a daughter. And so now the question is, who's going to be the king? Jephthah or Yahweh? And it says, the Spirit of the Lord came upon Jephthah, and the Spirit came upon him, and the Spirit moved him to vow a vow. And as he went out to battle, he said, I vow that I will send up to the Lord the first person who comes out of the doors of my house to greet me. Now, my Bible says, I will offer it up as a burnt offering. That's a mistranslation. The word translated burnt offering just means an ascension or ascending up. Now, if it's an animal and you want to send it up to heaven, you burn it up and turn it into smoke and it goes up to heaven. But if it's a person, you don't burn them up. You send them up to the hill of the Lord and they serve the Lord. What happens as he comes back from the battle? His daughter is the one that comes out to greet him, and so there goes his dynasty. And she goes up to the hill of the Lord and she serves as a deaconess, which means a woman who helps other women in the church. A deaconess is not a lady deacon. A deaconess works with women in the early church, and I think in the Bible. We discuss that today because we think a deaconess is the same as a lady deacon. That's not true. The deaconesses worked with the women, and that's a legitimate ministry. And it says that the daughters of Israel went up and had a little Bible conference with her 4 days every year, and she had a tremendous ministry, but she was building up Yahweh's house and Yahweh's kingdom instead of Jephthah's house and Jephthah's kingdom. Well, then the next story is Samson, which we're going to look at next week sometime. And the last two stories of the book have this refrain: there was no king in Israel, and everybody did what was right in his own eyes. Now, that does not mean, and this is what a lot of 20th century commentators interpret it to mean. They say, there was no king in Israel, so everybody did what was right in his own eyes. In other words, we didn't have a strong central government, and therefore there was nothing to restrain the people. That is not what this means. The king in the book of Judges is clearly identified as Yahweh, and his messengers have been clearly identified as the Levites. And the older interpreters, our Puritan fathers and Reformed Reformation fathers, and in fact the whole history of the church has always understood this until the 20th century, that the people were not recognizing Jehovah as king. And that's why there was anarchy in Israel. Both of these last two stories are about Levites. They're about pastors not doing their jobs. Judges 17 and 18, the next to the last story, we have this man Micah who sets up a counterfeit tabernacle, and then he says, I need a Levite to minister in this. And so then we read that there's a young man from Bethlehem in Judah who was a Levite and who's wandering around looking for a better church. He had one of these small country churches in Bethlehem, which was a poor town, and they weren't paying him very well, and not many people went, and the tithes were down, and so he decided he'd go look for a nicer church. So he wanders around, and he decides to become the priest of this man Micah at his false shrine, and he gets involved in idolatry. And at the end of the story, we find out that his name was Jonathan, the son of Gershom, the son of Moses. It's Moses' grandson. That's who this story is about. It says Manasseh in the Hebrew text, but it's written in such a way that we all know it's Moses that's being referred to here. Everybody knows this, by the way. This is not something unique with me. Your margins should tell you that. Then the next story is about a Levite whose concubine played the harlot, and he went to get her back, and after he got her back, he was on his way back to take her home, and some sons of Belial demanded that he be brought out for them to abuse, and he just kicked his concubine. Concubine is just an unendowed, unprotected wife. A wife in a weak position. A wife with no separate bank account of her own. Okay? No insurance. Totally helpless. And he just kicked her out, and they abused her all night, and she died. And he did not do what Jesus did for us. You know, we sinned against Jesus. He went to get us back. And then when they tried to kill him, he didn't kick us out and let us die instead. That's the meaning of this story. The Levites were supposed to display Yahweh's love to the people, and this man failed to do so. And because the Levites were failing to teach the Word of God, therefore the society was in anarchy. The kingship of Christ is made plain not through political action, but through the church. If the church will shape up and do her job, everything else will take care of itself in this country. We don't need to elect somebody else as president. Bill Clinton do just fine. When Joseph was in prison, God didn't put a new Pharaoh on the throne. He just sent nightmares to the old Pharaoh. And then the old Pharaoh had Joseph in, and when Joseph told him the gospel, the Pharaoh said, yeah, I think you're right, and put him in charge. When Daniel was in Babylon, God didn't get rid of Nebuchadnezzar, he just sent nightmares to Nebuchadnezzar. We don't need to get rid of Bill Clinton. We just need some nightmares. I suspect he probably has nightmares. But so far they haven't done any good. We need a real power nightmares, the kind that cause him to, call up Billy Graham. That's probably who he'd think of. Say, Billy, I need help. And I'm sure as far down as he is, Billy Graham could give him a lot of help. Then after that he can come to us and we'll finish the job. If our ways please the Lord, everything else takes care of itself. And all the anarchy that we read about in the book of Judges and all the other things that are problems here come about because of failure of the church. That's the bottom line of this book. It's not about politics. So I want to say that to you. Now, as we consider getting into the book of Judges, and I can see we're not going to get all that far tonight, look at the next page here, and just let me give you a little survey of the history of what's going on here, just in terms of chronology. And really, we're not going to study this. I just want you to have it. These dates here are Anno Mundi dates. They're dates from the creation, and so we're dating forward from the creation, not backwards from in BC dates. But you see the structure here and the overlap of Ehud and Barak's judgeship. And then on the third page, which looks like this, the next page of your notes here, page 3, it's not numbered in your copies. You see what's happening here in the year 2861. Look down your middle column. The fourth entry says 2861, oppression of Ammon. This happened exactly the same year as the oppression of Philistia. That is given us in Judges chapter 10, verse 7. The anger of Yahweh burned against Israel. He sold them into the hands of the Philistines and into the hands of the sons of Ammon. And the oppression of Ammon, which begins in 2861, ends when Jephthah defeats them. But in the south, that oppression begins at the same time that Samson and Samuel are born. We're told that that oppression lasted for 40 years. That's in chapter 13 of Judges. The Lord gave them into the hands of the Philistines for 40 years. We know that Samson and Samuel judged for 20 years. And at the end of Samuel's judgeship, we have the Battle of Mizpah when not the end of his judgeship, but after 20 years of his judgeship, we have the Battle of Mizpah in which the Philistines were defeated. We count back 20 years. Samuel is a young man. Samson is about 20. And we count back and we find that Samson and Samuel were contemporaries almost exactly. They graduated from high school in the same year. Samson and Samuel, they both lived in the same part of Israel too. They weren't very far apart. They knew each other. They got together for Bible studies. They were friends. They told war stories. But they didn't drink together because they were both Nazarites and neither one of them was allowed to drink. Now, once you get this chronology straight, something very interesting happens. The Battle of Mizpah, where Samuel and the little ragtag army of Israelites defeats the Philistines, you know what happened right before that? Just a couple of weeks earlier, Samson had pulled down the building and killed all 5 lords of the Philistines, all the commanders of the Philistine army, all the priests of Philistia, their entire nobility. So no wonder Samuel could defeat him. It's kind of a 1-2 punch. You don't get that unless you look at the chronology, because the book of Judges is one book and 1 Samuel is a different book, and you have to lay them out. But when you do, they're very similar. You also find that Saul comes to the throne in the year that Abdon, the last judge, dies, and so there's this transfer that takes place. But I wanted you to see that. I wanted, because we probably won't come back to it, but I know that you probably have never heard that before. Maybe you have in this church, but most people haven't heard that before, to realize that this is the historical picture. The Philistines conquer. And for 20 years, the people are laboring under Philistine difficulties. The Philistines had an iron monopoly. They would not allow the Israelites to have any iron weapons, which is kind of a disadvantage. If all you have is a wooden sword and you're going up against an iron sword, your wooden sword doesn't last. And if all you have is a bronze sword and you go up against an iron sword, the bronze sword just gets kind of sliced through by the iron sword. Which is why Saul has his spear, and David has his stones, and Jonathan has his arrows, and Samson has the jawbone of an ass. because they were not allowed to have swords and spears. Saul's spear was one of the only spears in Israel. They were beginning to rebuild by that time, but they didn't have much iron. And the Philistines oppressed Israel to some extent, but the Philistines, being Egyptians and being a combination of Greek and Egyptian culturally, they were really pretty cultured people. The Philistines were not barbarians. Now, the Ammonites and the Moabites were. When the Ammonites and the Moabites came sweeping through, they abused all the women, and they burned up all the fields, and they killed little kids, and they were really terrible. But the Philistines, nah. The Philistines had plays, they had opera, they had museums, they had libraries, airships. They were very cultured. They didn't really have airships. They were really high culture people. In fact, they were impressive. And the Israelites didn't have a lot of this high culture stuff. And actually, it wasn't all that bad to be under Philistine rule. In fact, the Philistines were actually okay. In fact, if you got to be dominated by somebody, there were a lot of worse people to be dominated by than the Philistines. Wouldn't allow you to have any iron. But other than that, they're pretty courteous. We're going to see that. When Samson goes down to marry this Philistine girl, okay. It's okay with them. So what does God do? Well, 20 years of Philistine rule. And Samson and Samuel, they've grown up under this their whole lives. They're now about 20 years of age. 20 years of age is the age that a young man is enrolled in the army, according to Numbers chapter 1. That's the year you come of age. So at the age of 20, Samson and Samuel are about 20, and the Israelites decide they're going to shake off the Philistine yoke. So they go have a big battle, and they lose the battle. And so they come back to Eli, the old high priest, and they say, we lost the battle. And they say, yeah, we lost the battle because we didn't have the ark. So they go and they take the ark out with them. They take the ark into battle. And the Egyptians win the battle and capture the ark. Now things are worse. The ark has been captured. Well, the ark goes into this Philistine-Egyptian territory, and of course, when God goes into Egypt, he brings plagues. So plagues come on the Philistines, and after a while, the Philistines get tired of all these plagues. You remember that the ark was put in the temple of Dagon, the god of the Philistines. And they put the Ark of the Covenant in there, and they uncovered it and backed out, and the next day they came in, and Dagon had fallen down. So they put him back up, and the next night they came back in the next morning, and Dagon had fallen down, and his head had fallen off. The priest came in, and they said, Dagon. I wish I could take credit for that, but that was R.C. Sproul's. It's too good not to repeat, though. So then they started getting bubonic plague. Rats were running through, and so the Philistines decided to send the ark back to Israel, loaded up with 5 golden rats and 5 golden emerods, whatever those are. Probably buboes in the neck. I wouldn't mind having a golden rat. That'd be about as much as I need to get out of, to set me up. But at any rate, nothing like a few golden rats. So the ark comes back with spoil from defeating the enemy. And so the ark does come back, but you see, now the Philistines are kind of torqued off. This is when Samuel starts to judge, because Eli keels over dead when this happens, remember? It's also when Samson starts to judge, because now things are worse. And now Samson starts to do his stuff. And Samson has to do 2 things. Well, basically he has to do one thing. Forget the 2. Because the people are cowed by the Philistines, they're impressed by the Philistine opera houses and all the Philistine culture and their statues and their ships and how great and mighty they are and their splendor. And because they're cowed by the might of the Philistines and they've been defeated in battle, and the Lord seems to have abandoned them by allowing the ark to be taken into captivity, everybody's just kind of settling down under a Philistine rule. So what Samson has to do is he has to stir things up. He's a guerrilla fighter. So he goes through and he does weird stuff, like grabbing 300 foxes, tying their tails together and sending them through the fields. That's weird. Killing a bunch of them with the jawbone of an ass. And he goes around and he makes little poems up, With the jawbone of an ass, heaps upon heaps, with the jawbone of an ass, I killed 1,000 men. And he goes around and he names things like Collar Spring and Jawbone Hill and other things. We'll see all this stuff. What's he doing? He's creating news. Rush Limbaugh is talking about this on the radio. It's in the Inquiring Minds Want to Know. There's all kinds of stuff about Samson and Samson meeting with saucer people and other stuff that is showing up in the newspapers around there because Samson is news. And he's making people laugh because he's a joke. He's funny. You know why the liberals hate Rush Limbaugh? And I don't think the sun rises and sets on Rush Limbaugh, although I am wearing it. You got to admit, this is a cool time. I don't care who designed it. But the liberals hate him because he's funny. He makes people laugh at them. And Samson goes around and he makes people laugh. And all of a sudden they realize that, history is a big joke. Satan thinks he wins. When Satan put Jesus on the cross, he thought he was defeating him. In reality, he was working out his own doom, right? Stupid. History is God's big joke. He that sits in the heavens laughs. And we laugh too. And it's funny. And he is laughing at those who conspire. Why do the heathen rage and the nations imagine the vain things? The kings of the earth take their stand and the rulers take counsel together against Yahweh and against his anointed, his Messiah. They say, let's break their bonds asunder and cast away their cords from us. He that sits in the heavens laughs. The Lord has him in derision. Samson makes the people laugh. Samson gives the people hope. Samson makes the Philistines irritated. Samson stirs the people up to realize that the Philistines are not invincible. 300 foxes can do a lot of damage. And so, that's what Samson has to do. Now, I don't know for sure, but it could be that we're too comfortable in America. And we need to learn to laugh a little bit at some of this. Laugh at the idiots who oppress us. Don't be too overwhelmed and in awe. People are they watch these evolutionary programs about the origin of the universe and they get so impressed with it because it's a very elegant, aesthetically pleasing. The Big Bang model is a very elegant, aesthetically pleasing fantasy tale. But it's pretty, especially when they have all these computer things that they show on PBS. But Christians get very impressed with this, and then they want to compromise Genesis chapter 1 and say, oh, well, maybe it's just a poem, or maybe, God made the universe 1 billion years ago, or whatever. Because they're so impressed, they're so cowed. Give me a break. 150 years ago, secular humanists did not believe the universe was billions of years old. And I can tell you this right now, 200 years from now, they won't believe it either. This is just a passing fancy. You think 200 years from now they will still think that the speed of light can't be broken? Do you think that 200 years from now they will still think that redshift is caused by stars moving away from us? No. We barely have any idea of what causes these things. We have mathematical models that make sense of them, but those models can change. This Hubble telescope is already filling in a bunch of information that challenges existing theories. That stuff will all be passé in 60 years. Some of you will live to see it be passé. Don't go selling out the Bible because of this stuff, but we get so impressed with it. Oh, well, I guess we better figure out some way to get around Genesis 1 because science says. Baloney. Science changes. That's my point. And real scientists know this. Real scientists know that these are only models to describe the appearance of what we know right now. And these are only models. They are not facts. And don't be impressed by it. Don't compromise the Bible, because the models will change in 30 or 40 years when new facts come in. Well, I think that this is probably where we should stop. One other thing I'd like to just point out to you, since we're kind of surveying Judges here, and then we will stop, and tomorrow night we will look at the Nazirite vow and get into the story itself. Just one other thing, in thinking about the structure of Judges and where the Samson story fits, let me put one other thing on the table for you. I find it really neat to see how the Bible fits together. I just think it's neat. I think it's neat to find out that the Philistines are Egyptians. And then to see that all the things that God does with the Philistines are parallel to the things that He does to the Egyptians. Because they're the same kind of thing. I just think that's neat. I love to figure out all these parallelisms and to see how consistent God's Word is with itself. God keeps saying the same thing over and over again, but each time with a slightly different slant so that we get another view of what He's talking about. If we go back to the book of Genesis, we will find 3 stages in the fall of man. The first fall takes place in the garden, where Adam and Eve decided to worship the devil instead of worshiping God. They decided to do what the devil said instead of doing what God said. And God kicked them out of the garden. The next fall happened in the land, where Cain killed Abel and went out and built a city. He really built a city on his brother's blood. Our city is built on brother's blood too, The New Jerusalem is built on the blood of our big brother Jesus Christ, who is also our husband. But Cain went out and he built the city on a brother's blood. And God kicked Cain out of the land and told him he couldn't live in the land anymore. He's going to have to wander around. And then the third sin was the sons of God intermarried with the daughters of men. That sin took place in the world. And God judged them by kicking them off the world in the flood. Now see those 3 stages. The garden sin, in the church, in the sanctuary, the land sin, which is a brother-brother sin, and then the sin of intermarriage in the world. Now the sons of God intermarrying with the daughters of men. That does not mean angels marry human women. Angels don't marry. Besides, that's got nothing to do with what's going on in Genesis. The sons of God there refers to the righteous, those who were in the church. And it says that good Christian guys were intermarrying with pagan girls. It says, the sons of God saw the daughters of men were beautiful. So the Christian guys were marrying the cute pagan girls instead of the ugly Christian girls. Well, that's not really exactly what it says. Maybe that's the wrong inference. Maybe I'd better get out of here. Any stones in here? Good. Whew. Back up. Okay. This business of seeing that they were fair and taking them. See, Eve saw that the fruit was fair and took it. Exactly the same language. So this is a third forbidden fruit. But it's the sons of Seth who are intermarrying with the daughters of men. And we know that this started to happen in the days of Enoch because we have Enoch's prophecy against the ungodly who in their ungodly ways are turning away. And that's a prophecy directed against the apostates. So the apostasy began in the days of Enoch. The sin of intermarriage. Okay, the sin of idolatry, the sin of brother murder, and the sin of intermarriage. Those are the 3 great sins. And that's what we have in Judges in the 3 central stories. Gideon commits the sin of idolatry by setting up that ephod. And all the people play the harlot with it. And that's the garden sin. The next story is the story of Gideon's son Abimelech. And what did Abimelech do? He persuaded the people to make him a king. He was actually Israel's first king. And the first thing he did was he got all of his brothers, all 70 of those brothers, and he killed them all. And he built his dynasty on the brothers' blood. In fact, it says that he killed them on one stone, which means that he consecrated them to Baal by killing them on an altar. They set up one stone, one place, and they killed those men one at a time in a sacrificial manner, making a sacrifice to Baal in order to build his city. That's a recapitulation of Cain and Abel, of Romulus and Remus for that matter. Brother sin. And the next story in Judges is about Jephthah and his brothers. And then the next story is about Samson. And what do all three stories about Samson concern? Philistine women. At the beginning of his ministry, Samson offers marriage to a Philistine girl, provided she trusts him. Now we're going to see that that was perfectly right for him to do. To offer salvation to the Gentiles if they'll trust you. So that there is that aspect of working with the pagans. But then the last two stories, he goes to a harlot in Gaza and he gets involved with Delilah. That's the sons of God intermarrying with the daughters of men. And so you see how Judges carries forth this theme of falls. The whole book of Judges is set conceptually on the Sabbath day. It's set in Genesis 3 when man is supposed to meet with God, and instead we had fallen from God and sinned against Him. And Judges amplifies that in great detail, what it means for us to sin against God and for God to restore us by the blood of Jesus Christ. And we'll see that in this story too. But even within that, this unpacking of the fall of man in three dimensions, the God-man sin, the brother-brother sin, the intermarriage sin, Judges flows through that same theme, giving us an expanded picture of each one of those. And the Samson narrative then is concerned with how you relate to the Gentiles, how you relate to the pagans. Okay? And that's the subtlety in this story. Now the Samson story is subtle. It's full of riddles. And we're told this right out. He makes a riddle. And then they come back with another riddle. And then he has a riddle contest with Delilah. And so we can't assume that everything in the Samson story is going to be plain and obvious to us. We have to read it twice. Look twice. Always look twice at a passage of the Bible. And look at it carefully, and we will be able to unlock the riddles. And we'll find a whole lot of interesting stuff here. So, please come back tomorrow, and I promise that we will get into Samson himself then. Do you want to have questions for a few minutes, or is it time for us to? Is there anything that needs clarification from what I've said? Probably everything. Well, thank you for being so courteous, and we'll see you tomorrow.